Welcome, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us today. I am beyond thrilled to introduce our guest to you. But before I do, I want to thank some folks that we always thank. We want to thank brassandwinds.com. Brass and Winds, a Quinn the Eskimo company. This is where we go when we're looking for brass or woodwind instruments for our students. They're the best in the business and they're very friendly, and we think you should give them a call. If you want to study with us, there's two ways. Truer MU. These are video lessons. They're online. And if you've never studied jazz before or piano and you'd like just a little taste, check us out there. If you want to study with us in person, come to willowschoolga.com, where we teach every kind of instrument and we'd be happy to work with you. Willow School GA. And now, without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to a man who is a 40-year veteran in the music industry. He was an A&R executive and a producer at CBS, RCA, and Warner Brothers. He signed Elvis Costello, Stevie Ray Vaughan, and Nick Lowe, among others. And he's a triple Grammy nominee for his compilations of Elvis Presley, Johnny Cash, and Frank Sinatra. Greg Geller, welcome to our show.
Thanks, Adam. Good to be with you.
I'm so happy to have you. You're a person who I think whose name many people don't know in particular, but you have changed the way we have listened to music. And I'm very excited to help folks understand just what you've done. First, I'd like to talk about you as an A&R person. It gives me kind of a giddy feeling to talk about this because the decisions you've been able to make in your job have changed who I am as a musician.
Well, I guess I'm glad to hear that.
Well, it's been in a good way. I mean, let's talk about Elvis Costello first and foremost. Now, there's a great story about how he got your attention. Do you recall that story?
I'm sure you're referring to his performance on the sidewalk outside the London Hilton on Park Road,
Right.
1977. I remember it well.
Now, he wasn't just performing on the sidewalk. He was performing across the street from an international convention for CBS Records. Isn't that correct?
That's right. That's why I was there.
Yeah. So you were at that convention.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, we had an annual convention that was held in a different city every summer, and that summer it was in London.
And so it just impressed you that he had that kind of guts to do that?
You know, there was a small group of us who left the morning's convention proceedings, which were held at the London Hilton. And as we left the hotel, we were confronted by this figure on the street. Had a guitar which was plugged into a small portable amp, and there was a fellow sort of parading in front of him with a sandwich board sign that said, Elvis Costello and Stiff Records welcome CBS Records to London. See Elvis tomorrow night at Dingwalls, which was a famous club, so to speak, in London back in those days. So he sang two songs. The first one was Welcome to the Working Week, which seemed somehow appropriate. And I'm not fully sure what the second one was because I was so taken by what then transpired. A London bobby wagon pulled up, and two London bobbies got out and arrested him and took him away. And that was my first encounter with Elvis Costello. But what happened from that point on was that a colleague of mine, a fellow named Dick Wingate, visited the Stiff Records offices, and Elvis's record album had just come out that very day. And Dick brought back a bunch of them, and he handed them out to several of us. And I brought my home, along with, probably 30 other albums that I acquired during the course of my week in London. And because of that experience, it was the first one I listened to when I got home. And I don't think I ever got around to listening to the others. I was so taken by it, and somewhere during that process, I got the brainstorm that, while it was an album I was listening to, it was only out in England and it was available elsewhere. And so at that point on, it was my goal to attempt to sign Elvis Costello, which I was able to do.
On a scale of 1 to 10, as far as people trying to get your attention, what is that? Is that a 9 or is that a 5? What is that?
Oh, I'd say it's probably a 9.5. I'm
Um,
not sure. I'm not sure what would succeed any better than that.
yeah, yeah. He was never afraid to get into a little trouble to attract attention. For instance, his Saturday Night Live stunt, which he did at a fairly early age in his career, which kept him off the show for 30 years.
That's right.
How long did you continue your association with him?
Well, in a sense, it continues to this day. I mean, in the sense that we're friends and we're in touch with one another. And I certainly go to see him whenever he, comes through the area, which I just got notice earlier today will be in October.
Oh, that's terrific. Yeah,
Yeah.
he's maintained a very robust career. He's a very interesting artist and has he's had his ups and downs like everyone, but his ups and downs tend to be more even than most people's, I think.
Well, he's never reluctant to try something new. I mean, every album is a change of pace in a sense. And I suppose some are more successful than others, but they are never without interest. I find them almost universally excellent.
I would agree. And as I said, listening to his music in college changed the way I decided to start writing music. So I greatly appreciate your decision to sign him and let me hear him. Thank you.
You're very welcome.
So a related figure, I think it has relationship to that very week, was Nick Lowe. Can you talk a little bit about signing Nick Lowe?
Well, you're right. It's directly related to the signing of Elvis Costello because in September of '77, I had to make a business trip to Paris to check out the new album by a disco artist, a fellow named Cerrone, who was very successful back in those days. He wanted me to listen to his new album, which I did. But I figured as long as I was in the neighborhood, I would pop over to London again because I'd never actually met Elvis's manager, a fellow named Jake Riviera. So I did that. I show up at Jake's flat one day, and he's on the phone talking, as it turns out, to Clive Davis. And when he gets off the phone, he says, "Come with me, we're going to see Nick Lowe, who's in the studio mixing his next single." So sure, I'm happy to do that. And we walk into the studio and Nick is mixing a song called "I Love the Sound of Breaking Glass." And I was just, once again, just really taken by the song. It was unique. It was really, really unusual for the time and for any time for that matter. And in conjunction with the single that I was already familiar with, which was "So It Goes" and "Heart of the City," those three songs kind of convinced me on the spot that we should attempt to sign Nick as well as Elvis. Nick, who was producing Elvis's records at that time, and was also Jake Riviera's flatmate. I mean, they actually roomed together. So it was a pretty tight-knit situation.
Yeah.
We all got along famously, and the rest is history, as they say.
Yeah, and as part of that history, Nick Lowe recorded his most famous song, "Cruel to Be Kind," and I have a little story that he tells about your relationship around that song. I hope you don't mind my telling it here.
Not at all.
Nick Lowe,
better you than me.
Okay, well, we'll see how that goes. What Nick says was, Greg was the sort of A&R man you dreamed of getting. Instead of the flash, Harry, "Yeah, baby, I love you" type I was used to, he looked like a Harvard professor, quietly spoken and modest, yet extremely knowledgeable about all kinds of music. Each time he rang me, he'd mention Cruel to Be Kind. But by 1979, I was this hip new wave producer who'd worked with Elvis Costello, Graham Parker, and The Damned, and the song sounded embarrassingly pre-new wave to me. So I'd respond unenthusiastically, "Oh yeah, you like that, Greg? Great, but I've got a better song here about a woman who was eaten by her dog." Greg bet me $200 it would be a top 10 record. It only got to number 12, both in the UK and US, and I never picked up the money, but it was a hit all around the world. Can you elaborate on that great story?
Well, what happened was that we did in fact sign Nick, and in the winter of 1978, a tour was set up, headlined by Elvis, whose record had been released in the States the preceding November. And the second act on the bill was Mink DeVille, and the opening act was Nick Lowe, backed by Rockpile. And in order to promote the tour, we put together a sampler record, a song by each artist. It was kind of a nifty item because it was 12-inch, 33 1/3 RPM, pressed in gold vinyl, and on one side had a Columbia label that was at that point Elvis and Nick's label, and on the other side it had a Capitol Records label, Mink DeVille's label. So it was kind of a unique item, and the songs from Elvis and Mink DeVille were both previously released, but the Nick song was unreleased at that point. And the tape box that I got that contained that song called it "You've Gotta Be Cruel to Be Kind." Gotta spelled Gotta. And so that's the name that is on the label and is on the packaging of this promotional disc. But I really loved the song. Couldn't get it out of my head, in fact. And when that happens, that convinces me that a song probably ought to be a single. So it was at that point that I started, harping on Nick to redo it. Turns out that what I had been listening to was a late period recording by Nick's old group, Brinsley Schwartz. And I had certain different ideas as to what form it should take. I mean, the song itself I thought was classic. I thought it could be recorded somewhat better for the American market, slowed down just a tad, and maybe with some backing vocals included. Anyway, they did a terrific job, Rockpile did, in the studio, and the record came out and was in fact a hit.
Nick Lowe has continued to write songs his whole life. I heard him. It's probably been about 15 years since I last heard him performing, and I really liked what he was doing. How would you assess him? He's obviously had a lot of worn other hats, as well as been a producer, and has been influential in the music business. But as a performer, what do you suppose has kept him out of the spotlight?
Well, at a certain point, Nick, to his credit, took the mature decision to stop attempting to be a pop star. At a certain point, I'm not sure what age he was, probably over 40. And I think he started to feel a little inauthentic trying to make hit records per se. I mean, but he's always been a great songwriter. And so he just began writing on more mature themes, I think. And he's done very nicely at it. There's not really a place for him on American pop radio at this point, but he has a loyal following and he makes wonderful records to this day.
Another musician that I love that you signed was Stevie Ray Vaughan. Could you talk a little bit about what you did for him and what you did with him?
Well, the signing of Stevie Ray Vaughan is somewhat different. I have to go back quite a few years, actually, before Stevie was signed. I developed a relationship with a legendary A&R man named John Hammond. And John became something of my mentor, actually, when I went to work at CBS Records. I had met him just prior to that, believe it or not, at the Copacabana nightclub, seeing Bobby Vinton in my former role as a trade journalist at Record World magazine. Anyway, I was seated with John, and we struck up a friendship, which blossomed over the years when I went to work at CBS, where he was at that time still on staff as an A&R man. And I was at Epic Records, he was at Columbia Records. And while the twain rarely met, because we were friendly, he would frequently send artists to me that he, for whatever reason, either didn't have the strength to pass on, or didn't feel right for Columbia, or just simply wanted me to hear. And they were always interesting, but they were never particularly suitable for us at Epic either. Until one day, he brought me Stevie Ray Vaughan. At that point, I had been hearing about Stevie, people who were coming back from Texas. In fact, one of them being Jake Riviera, manager of Elvis and Nick, had mentioned him. So I knew the name. The name rang a bell, and I was happy to listen to this, what was really nearly a finished record at that point. Not quite, but it was professional recording.
This is his debut?
Yeah. It was the album that ultimately became Texas Flood. So, I mean, what did I do? I didn't do a whole lot. I mean, they then went into the studio just to finish it up. And I think maybe my major contribution, besides actually instigating his signing to Epic Records, was that when we were in the studio, there was a conversation that took place as to what he should be called. Should he be Stevie Vaughan, which is what most people called him, or should he be Stevie Ray Vaughan? And I was very strongly in favor of Stevie Ray Vaughan, just because I thought it was distinctive. And to be honest with you, I had Jerry Lee Lewis in mind. It just sounded more like a rock and roll name to me. And so he became, for better or worse, he became Stevie Ray Vaughan for the rest of his life.
You made an extremely astute comment about Stevie Ray Vaughan that I would like to share. Something that I think had always been in the back of my mind, but I couldn't articulate until I read it. What you said was, well, I'm going to paraphrase here. In my opinion, this is my take on what you said. When Stevie Ray plays guitar, he is one of the best blues guitarists in the world. But when he sings, he is unique. And that was the thing you pointed out, that it's actually the way he puts his voice into that entire blues thing that he's doing that really makes him special.
Yeah, my feeling has always been, well, I've never been real comfortable with white blues singers in general when they sound inauthentic to me. But he was completely believable. He sounded at ease with what he was doing. Sounded like it came naturally to him. I think he was head and shoulders above the competition when it came to his singing. Obviously, as a guitar player, he was beyond compare as well. So if ever there was a no-brainer of a signing, to me, he was it, especially coming along when he did. By 1983, if you recall, the kind of music that was being made, it was a lot of synth-driven electro pop, dance, club stuff, all of which I loved. But it seemed to me that a vast segment of the market was being ignored in the process. That there were still folks out there that craved blues-influenced electric guitar, rock and roll. Yeah, that's what he did.
So was he the only person to fill that gap, or were there? I mean, I guess ZZ Top to some extent might have filled that gap. I'm trying to think. It's a really interesting point that there were folks who were looking for something. Music was getting more and more synthy, and some of the authenticity seemed to be getting produced right out of it. And
Yeah.
when you listen, even if the records are well produced, you can hear everything that's happening with the musicians doing it in front of you. So
Mhm. Got to be safe for that.
there is, yeah. And
Yeah.
so I agree. This is, your gap theory that there's always a place in music where the market is open and the available material is not necessarily filling some spot. And if you can fill that spot,
Yeah, no question about it. I mean, there's a real market out there for virtually any kind of music you can imagine. Whether it's polka or, well, I mean, you name it. There's folks out there that are into it. You just have to figure out how to reach them.
well, of course, if you're a record label and you have lots of money, it's, and it's not easy to reach them, but easier than, for instance, maybe today where somebody like me is just going to spend my own budget to reach people. Do you have any thoughts about reaching people today?
I don't know how you do it, to be honest with you. I mean, obviously, the internet is a glorious thing, but how do you lead people to what you're doing on the internet? I'm at a loss, to be honest with you. It clearly it happens from time to time, but it almost seems like it's a fluke. Uh, there's some extraneous Deus ex machina thing happening where Providence reaches down and says, Olivia Rodrigo, you're it.
Right.
I'm sure there's a lot more to it than that, but I've been removed from that aspect of the business for a very long time now. So, and happily so, I might add.
I
It's
understand.
always been extremely difficult to break new artists, and seems to me it's even more so now.
Well, yeah, I want to talk about this a little bit because while there aren't as many gatekeepers as there used to be, or maybe the necessity of gatekeepers is not what it used to be, there are still gatekeepers. And there's something you said significant. You said something when you in an interview with someone about signing Stevie Ray Vaughan, about how sometimes you'll find somebody who is interesting, and sometimes you'll find somebody who is really interesting, but you don't think you can release them. This is the bane of every creative person's existence. The idea that, oh, you find me interesting, I'm sure you can sell me if you just try. What is it that turns somebody from being interesting or even brilliant into somebody that you can sell?
It's all about context. I mean, and context includes um, the company for which you're working, uh, the, the type of artists that company might specialize in, the number of artists that company is releasing at any given time, the state of the market at any given time, the state of radio. At least back in my day, when radio was the key to exposing a new artist. There's just so many different factors. And, I worked at major record labels throughout my career. We always had too many records in release at any given time. And perfectly valid, um, worthwhile music um, got shunted aside just because of the sheer numbers. Um, when I worked at Columbia Records in the late 70s, we had, I think, 15 people on the A&R staff. And so, well, I'll just recount one experience. While Elvis was in the process of being signed, this was before Nick, this is shortly after we began the process of signing Elvis Costello, I went up to Boston to see a band named The Cars perform.
Yeah.
And they were terrific. So I reported back to a man named Don Ellis, who was my boss at the time. I mean, you've heard stories like this from Tom Werman, for instance,
Right.
about the same fellow, Don Ellis,
Yeah.
one of my best friends in life. Um, and, you know, I told him how great this band, the Cars, were. And he said to me, well, you know, you're signing Elvis Costello. You know, you've got 15 of you on the staff. If each one of you were to sign even one artist at a time, that's too many. You can't deal with that many new acts. And so you certainly can't sign two. Make a choice, he said to me. It's kind of like Sophie's Choice.
Yeah. Cars or Elvis
Uh,
Costello. Yeah.
But, you know, I mean, the Elvis negotiations were already underway. I mean, I was committed there, so that was my choice. And I don't regret it at all, but of course, the Cars went on to sell quite a few records in their day.
Yeah.
And it could have been on Columbia Records, but of course, we'll never know whether they would have been as successful had they been on Columbia Records, because what they did included having hit singles, unlike Elvis, who really didn't require hit singles to achieve whatever success he was going to achieve. It would have been nice if he had had a hit single, but it didn't happen. Could the Cars have had those hit singles on Columbia while we were busy promoting Neil Diamond and Earth, Wind and Fire, and on and on and on, all these acts that we had that would have taken priority? So we'll never know. I mean, it worked out for the best for all concerned. That's the way I have to look at it. Still, you know, it's a bit of a regret, certainly. And a few months later, you know, I basically took it upon myself to commit to signing Nick before I ran it by Don, just because I knew I'd probably get the same kind of response.
Right. Did you see this career for yourself when you were young? Well, when we spoke to Tom Werman, he had, you know, no idea that this was going to be his path. He was on cue to be, you know, some kind of business person in advertising or something, until he just rebelled and freaked out and ran to music. Did you have a similar path, or did you always feel like music was where you wanted to be?
Well, music was always a part of my life as a listener. I mean, I don't play a musical instrument. I play the phonograph. That's seriously. I mean, that's, you know, I've for as long as I can remember, I've been surrounded by music. And my father was into Josh White and Lead Belly. And, you know, we had Bessie Smith records at home. And Tom Lehrer was a great favorite in the house. John Jacob Niles. And in the early 50s, I remember weekly car trips with my father where we listened to, you know, the radio, listened to the pop music of the early 50s, you know, Frankie Lane and Teresa Brewer and that kind of stuff. And, you know, and then one day there was Elvis Presley. And in hindsight, my life was, you know, my destiny was really determined that first appearance by Elvis Presley on the Dorsey Brothers stage show, which preceded the Jackie Gleason show on TV. But at the time, I had no concept of what a record company was or what a record company did. In fact, I really didn't have a concept of that even when I graduated from college. I will say, though, that when I was a kid, because I was so taken by music, when adults would ask me what I wanted to be when I grew up, I would always say I wanted to be a DJ, just to kind of shut them up. But it seemed like an attractive proposition, if unrealistic, you know. Anyway, when I graduated from college, I through a series of events, ended up working at Record World Magazine, which is a trade paper um, in the music business. Actually, I was recommended to work there by one of my best friends from college, a fellow named Bob Merlis. So I went to work at Record World, and when you work at a trade paper for an industry, you learn all about that industry, and you meet a lot of people in the industry. And in pretty short order, I found myself being the editor of Record World, which was a pretty serious job, turning out a publication every week. And being very envious of my friends who were working at record companies and, going to shows and getting records. So when the opportunity presented itself, I was informed there was an opening at Epic Records by my friend Tom Werman, who then introduced me to Don Ellis, his boss. I grabbed it. And that's how I ended up in the record business.
Yeah. So just basically your first job out of college, which could have been anything, just happened to pull you in the direction of the music business, and you did very well there. Yeah.
I had this vague thought that a career in journalism was where I would end up. It wasn't a career in music journalism, probably more a career in political journalism, maybe be a columnist for the New York Times, writing about politics.
Uh-huh.
But as I said, my friend Merlis, he walked right into a job at Record World, and I watched what he was doing for a while, and indicated that I'd like to do that too. And he recommended me the first time there was an opening, and I got the gig.
So these threads, we have several threads that have come up in the last 5 minutes that lead us to the next phase of your career that we're going to talk about. First is seeing Elvis Presley and what an impact that made on you. Second is your desire to write and to be a writer. You managed to kind of fulfill both passions in your moving on to creating compilations of artists. And this is a very interesting thing that I don't think I ever gave more than a passing thought to until I started researching you. For instance, let's start with Elvis Presley, who, when I'm 52 now, so he died when I was about 9 years old, and I knew him as a kind of a remarkable story. And then by the time I started listening to music seriously, he was considered a major force. What I didn't know is in the interim between the time he died and the time to listen to music, his star had faded and he wasn't doing so hot. And the reason that he is revered now is due, at least in part, to your rediscovery of and reintroduction of him through the compilation.
Yeah, he died in 1977. Actually, less than a month after I first saw Elvis Costello, but that's neither here nor there, just an interesting
coincidence. Yeah.
And RCA Records, his longtime label, over the years released a variety of projects. At a certain point, it got to be one worse than the one that preceded it. And they were generating lots of bad press, and sales had plummeted. Obviously, when an artist of that stature dies, the first thing that happens is that the sales skyrocket. But by the time I got to RCA in '83, Elvis's sales were pretty negligible. And that happened to coincide just shortly thereafter with the advent of the compact disc. And the compact disc provided an opportunity to reissue historic catalogs of music. I mean, record companies over the next several decades really took advantage of this new format to go back to revisit, their old catalogs, and remaster and spruce things up. So, as a longtime Elvis fan, I always had ideas for what I would do if given the chance. And lo and behold, all of a sudden, I had the chance. So we did a number of different things. I mean, there was a box set that kind of launched the program called the Golden Celebration, which included a number of different things. There was a show, a very early Memphis show, kind of a ragged recording, but of extreme historic interest. There were his numerous television appearances in 1956, the year that he made his big breakthrough. Anyway, there was a number of these different areas that this box set enabled me to explore. We then also simultaneously really reissued his earliest albums in mono, as opposed to the fake reprocessed stereo sound that they had only been available for the previous 20 odd years. And then I had a series of sort of themed compilations that I released over time, concentrated on different aspects of his music, whether it's rock and roll or ballads or blues or country, you name it. So, the first thing that happened was that we generated a lot of favorable press for the first time. And that led to healthy sales. So in effect, Elvis was back.
So you loved Elvis Presley as a kid, and then you got a chance to explore him in real time. So here's a quote that by you about that. You do projects like this as a labor of love, you say, because when you do something like this, your first order of business isn't to generate a profit. You may do that incidentally, but you can't count on it. You do it for the thrill of discovery, for the thrill of sharing this stuff. You do it because these are the kinds of things you dreamed of when you began listening to records. What did you discover about Elvis Presley in the process of creating this compilation?
Well, first of all, I discovered songs that I had never heard before, or earlier versions of songs. For instance, to this day, one of my greatest thrills in my entire career was discovering the original take of his first song, That's All Right. Just kind of accidentally coming across it in the RCA vaults. It differs in significant ways from the released version. And what that shows is just the process of making a record. It doesn't start out fully formed. It doesn't start out the way you ultimately hear it. It's a trial and error approach to making records.
Did that surprise you?
I came to realize that was true. Well, certainly throughout his early career. He would do scores of takes of certain songs till he got them the way he wanted to hear them. I mean, he was really the producer of his records, and I don't think any of us fully appreciated that until we started being able to hear the process of recording those songs in the studio. So that was really the most important thing. He wasn't simply a pretty face and a great voice. He was a musician.
So this is something that you discovered? This is something you really didn't know about him?
I hadn't really given it a whole lot of thought. There were different people that were always credited as the producer of his records. Sam Phillips, certainly at Sun Records in the early days. Steve Scholz at RCA in the early days of RCA. And I don't doubt that they played a significant role, but I think that Elvis was really the creator of his sound and his records.
And in terms of raising the star of Elvis and raising the respect to him, this is a nice way to do that, to show that he was thinking hard about the music he was writing, which
Yeah,
isn't guaranteed. You hear the pop results, and it could have been crafted. It could have been he was a pretty face with a good voice, but no, he was a thinking man.
exactly, exactly. Yeah, I think he, traditionally hasn't been given a whole lot of credit for that.
Peter Guralnick's biography of him, I don't know if you read it, also goes to great lengths to talk
Sure.
about what a thinking man Elvis was and how intellectual he actually was or tried to be.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. So you did other compilations. You did one about Johnny Cash. You want to talk about that one?
Well, I've done a great many Johnny Cash projects.
Yeah.
One, I sat down one day and did a count, and I stopped counting when I realized there was somewhere over 120 Johnny Cash CDs.
Okay.
Some of them were I mean, there was one collection of the complete Columbia albums of Johnny Cash.
Yeah.
So that was over 80 right there. But yeah, I've done a couple of Johnny Cash box sets. There was one in the early days of the CD. And, this was around 1990, I guess. And then later on, maybe 15 years later, I did another one. That was the one that was nominated for a Grammy. The first one, basically, I just approached his career chronologically, going back to the Sun Records days, following it through to the end of his time on Columbia Records, which was in the mid-1980s. The second time around, I decided, I needed to do something different. So I decided to approach it more in terms of types of music. I mean, in different categories, if you will. I mean, there were a couple of CDs of his hits, certainly, because people expect to get the hit records. But I also I did a CD of his collaborative works with other artists, and another CD of his recordings of sort of more traditional American songs, you know, which he specialized in over the years. So there was that. The one that I'm most proud of, though, wasn't really a box set. It was a 2 CD set, and it was called Personal File. What happened was that after he died, a group of us from Sony, a successor company to Columbia, went down to Nashville to visit the House of Cash and his son, John Carter Cash. And while we were there, we discovered, a whole bunch of tapes. And there wasn't time to listen to those tapes while we were there. So we had them boxed up and sent to New York. And I spent 2 months, 2 solid months, listening to those tapes and, archiving them and, taking notes, basically. And in amongst the tapes were boxes that were labeled Personal File. And what they were was Cash and guitar singing songs, like, unplugged. Very, very comparable to what he later did for Rick Rubin and American recordings.
Mm-hmm.
But this is from, the basically from the 70s. And they were terrific. He would tell stories about the songs, place them in his history. And there were a lot of late 19th century, early 20th century ballads. There was a whole bunch of gospel songs. There were some the kind of pop songs that he heard as a kid, faraway places with strange sounding names, that kind of stuff, pop music of the 40s. Anyways, really quite wonderful. And I was able to, extract 2 CDs worth of really valid performances from those tapes and assemble it in such a way that it was as if we were sitting in his living room and he was performing for you. And we put that out and did quite nicely.
Were these recordings of performances he was doing for people, or was he just privately journaling into a tape recorder here?
Yeah, it was just him and a tape recorder.
He just felt like doing it.
Yeah, well, when I say him and a tape recorder, he, at the House of Cash was a recording studio back in those days. It was his own studio. And I imagine that he had an engineer there. I mean, they were, for the most part, well recorded.
I guess the question I'm asking is, why was he doing this? It sounds like he was thinking of releasing a compilation of his own someday if he was talking about the songs.
Yeah, I think you'll have no way to know this for sure, but I'm almost certain he was, plotting out an album that just never quite got around to.
What year was this? When was this?
This was early 70s for the most part.
Yeah,
after his great success in his TV show.
This is a real weird connection, but Mike Bloomfield released a very odd collection of his favorite songs and him talking about them. And Mike Bloomfield is hardly a household name anymore, but he was very influential at the time. And I wonder if there's a connection.
I think the only connection would be that they're great artists who were interested in revealing their influences and were, they were literate about it, if I could put it that way.
Yeah, right.
Cash certainly had plenty to say and said it well about this music.
Yeah. So it's interesting, again, to hear these artists as thinking people when they're not presented that way necessarily by the market. And you have the opportunity to, as a thinking person yourself, share that aspect of these artists with us.
Yeah, it's a privilege, certainly. And, you don't want to overdo it. I mean, there is a tendency, I think, in the age of reissues to start reissuing stuff that probably should have been left in the can. And so, for instance, I got out of the Johnny Cash business, when I felt we were, we basically done it all.
Yeah.
Same thing with Elvis, really. I mean, I think, there's some material that doesn't get released and you can't figure out why. But then there's other material that doesn't get released, and it's pretty easy to tell why. All you have to do is listen to it.
Yeah.
So, it requires some discernment on the part of the producer.
Well, YouTube is ideal for transmitting that material out there.
Yeah.
Didn't you also do a compilation for Frank Sinatra?
I did many compilations for Frank Sinatra.
So what help did he need? Did his star ever fall? I mean, Frank Sinatra is sort of demigod.
He had, certainly during the course of his career, he had his ups and downs. I mean, he was, my mother's idol in the 1940s, but by the late 40s and early 50s, his career was on the skids until he moved to Capitol Records and hooked up with Nelson Riddle and made, most of the records that he was most famous for. Then in the early 60s, he started his own company, Reprise Records. And that's the company that he was essentially with until the end, although that there was a duets album that he did right at the end that was released by Capitol, not Reprise. But for from 1960 until the early, actually mid 80s, he was on Reprise, and that's where I worked in the 90s and the early 2000s. And so I had occasion to work with that material. And during that time, well, he had major hit records in the mid 60s, fair degree of success in the early 60s. But then, by the late 60s, early 70s, his star had faded somewhat in terms of recordings, never in terms of live appearances. He even retired for a while. Then he came back and had a renewed burst of acclaim, really culminating in his recording of New York, New York, which we hear at the end of every New York Yankee game, New York
Right.
City.
So a compilation in his case, again, are you really rewriting anything, or are you simply taking?
Well, in his case, I mean, first of all, the project that I was nominated for a Grammy on was simply a collection of everything he recorded for Reprise.
Okay.
So it was 20 CDs, 400 some odd songs like that, including a handful of things that had never been released, some of which were quite good. But there's no real art to doing that kind of work, in the sense it doesn't require any judgment calls. Really, you're doing the complete works, and therefore you have to include everything. I much prefer the kind of compilations where you have to make some decisions, what to include, what story to tell. I did one on Sinatra called "Everything Happens to Me." "Everything Happens to Me" was, for my money at least, the best of the previously unreleased recordings that I came up with. And so I kind of named the compilation afterward. And it impacted my selection of the songs. I wanted it to kind of tell a story about this guy and his life. And I think it worked quite well, as a matter of fact. On the other hand, I did another one, back in the, I guess it was the late 90s, early 2000s. Every record company, with every artist they could manage, put out a love songs compilation. A special Valentine's Day release.
Right.
And, we were no different. We did a Frank Sinatra love songs compilation. I was able to license 4 sides from Capitol Records, which was nice. Not always able to do those things, but they had something. We had something that they wanted to release, and we had some songs we wanted to use, so we worked out a trade.
Sounds like a prisoner exchange program.
Yeah, something like that. Yeah, exactly. Songs frequently are held prisoners by record companies.
Yeah.
Anyway, this Sinatra love songs compilation returned him to the charts for the first time in years. It was a resounding success. Did really well. Got a gold record for it on the wall here even today. So that's a more generic kind of thought, but nonetheless, I had to choose the songs for it. They had to convey a certain thought, certain message.
You've done compilations for other artists as well. Sam Cooke is the one I can name immediately. Are there any compilations that you're particularly proud of that you think we would not have heard of that you'd like to share?
Well, you mentioned Sam Cooke.
Yeah.
And actually, the one that I'm particularly proud of is not really a compilation at all. Sometimes in the course of this work, you come up with something that has simply never seen the light of day. And in Sam Cooke's case, it was a live recording of 3 shows that he did in 1963 at the Harlem Square Club in Miami, a black nightclub in which his performance couldn't have been less like his performance at the Copacabana, which was the live recording that had been released in his lifetime. The Harlem Square Club sat in the can for 20 years. And as I was leaving CBS to go to work at RCA, a friend of mine, a guy named Joe McEwen, said to me that he had heard there were these live recordings of Sam Cooke in the RCA vault and that I should check it out. So I did. And lo and behold, 3 shows. Turns out that of the 3, only one of them was really well recorded. It's a very difficult situation to record. The guys, the engineers who had recorded it in 1963 were still at the company. So they could, describe the adverse conditions in which they had to work in this place. But they managed to get one show down pat and a few songs from another show. We were able to turn that into an album, which I think was a revelation in many respects to many people. Because as great as Sam Cooke was, and as many hits as he had, he was always a pretty refined recording artist. And this presented him in a whole different, funky, new light. Performing for a black crowd. It's a sensational show. And a lot of people consider it to be one of the greatest live recordings of all time. I would tend to agree with that.
I'm happy to hear about it.
I'm very, very proud of that one. And it enabled us, because it had generated so much attention, we then followed it up with just a compilation of his greatest hits, in effect. 28 songs on 1 CD or 2 LPs. This was when CDs and LPs were both being released at the same time. And what makes that an interesting story is that in the UK, where this compilation was released, the song Wonderful World by Sam Cooke was used in a commercial for Levi's 501 jeans. So the company in the UK released Wonderful World as a single, and it went top 5 in the UK and stayed there for, I think, 8 or 10 weeks, something like that. So we sold a bunch of albums, and then it spread. It was #1 in Holland, I think top 5 or 10 in Germany, eventually went top 10 in Australia. So Sam Cooke became like this worldwide hit in 1985, 20 years after his death. Yeah. So that's just kind of a great story that can happen if you're lucky.
Is there something about the artists that you are doing these compilations for, and perhaps the artists that you've signed, that they have in common?
Well, I'd love to say that they're all great songwriters, and many of them are, because that's my first order of business is always the song itself, but kind of a diverse array, Mm-hmm. I think what the thing that they have in common is the quality of their work. I don't know how else to put it. Now, I've done other things that perhaps don't display quite that degree of quality, but yeah, the best of the artists that I signed and produced compilations and reissues on are amongst the best artists of all time. I've been very fortunate.
What constitutes quality for you?
Well, it's everything from that innate ability, talent. Some people are simply more talented than others. But when it comes to records, it has to do with the quality, the nature of the recording itself. And as I said, the the quality, the nature of the song, the material itself. Even if they're not a songwriter themselves, the selection of material is all important. So, some people are simply better at it than others. I mean, Sinatra didn't write. Elvis Presley didn't really write, but each in his own way selected, a great many songs that were absolutely perfectly suited for him as an artist. Another artist an act that I signed early on was a group called La Belle. And that's kind of an interesting story in terms of song selection. So I signed them in 1973 or 4, I guess. Around the same time that I was also involved in signing an artist named Minnie Riperton. And the original plan was that Minnie was going to go to New Orleans to record with Allen Toussaint, a great New Orleans producer of many, many hits, in particular in the 60s, but who was then sort of staging a comeback in the early 70s. So Minnie was due to go to New Orleans to work with Allen when Stevie Wonder decided that he wanted to produce her album. Now, you don't turn Stevie Wonder down, especially not in 1974, whatever it was. And so Allen Toussaint, his studio was vacant. He needed something to do. And we were still in the process of figuring out who was going to produce the La Belle album. And my main goal for them was that they should work with a really solid, funky rhythm section. I was thinking in terms of Kool and the Gang, those kind of records. Although not necessarily Kool and the Gang per se, but just that, kind of records they were making, Hollywood swinging, funky stuff, like those kind of records back then. Anyway, Toussaint works with the Meters, the ultimate funky New Orleans band. So La Belle goes down to New Orleans, and they brought with them a song called Lady Marmalade that had been written by Bob Crewe and Kenny Nolan. A great, distinctive, unusual song, but we'll never know what kind of record it would have turned out to be had they not brought a song about a hooker in New Orleans down to New Orleans to work with Allen Toussaint. I mean, it was the perfect marriage of song and producer and artist. And it happened kind of by accident, by happenstance, so sometimes serendipity is at play. And you just, you accept it and you take credit for the genius behind it.
Well, serendipity for me was getting a chance to interview you today. I greatly appreciate you taking the time. I'm sure we've just barely scratched the surface of the stories that you could tell. Thank you for being with us today.
My pleasure. Thanks, Adam.
We also want to thank you, our audience. If you've enjoyed this interview with Greg Geller, please check out our other interviews. We have an interview with his colleague, Tom Wehrman. We have actually 2 of those interviews, and they're both wonderful. His work with Cheap Trick and with other artists. We also have a 3-part interview with Mother's Finest, the band. They are still out there, and they're still doing amazing things. We want to know what you'd like to hear, so please drop us a line on our YouTube channel, like our videos, and subscribe. We hope to see you again, and have a great day.